There are things that people in certain rooms have decided they already know. Not because they are unkind and not because they are careless, but because the world has given them a version of the thing, a compressed, second-hand, sometimes accurate and sometimes not version. And the version has settled into the place where the actual knowledge would go if the actual knowledge had ever been offered. This is a story about one of those things. About the specific, compressed, second-hand version of arranged marriage that a lot of people in a lot of rooms are carrying without having examined what they are carrying. And about a woman named Meera who was 64 years old and who had been married for 42 years and who sat down with Steve Harvey on a game show stage. And in the course of answering his questions with the direct, unhurried, completely honest quality she brought to everything, dismantled the version and replaced it with something true. Something specific and human and theirs, hers and her husband Rajan's. That was not a version of anything, but was the actual thing, told by the person who had lived it, in a room that received it with the specific, complete, wide-eyed attention of a room that is understanding something it thought it already understood. And about what Steve Harvey said when he heard all of it, which was not what anyone expected him to say, and which was better. Hit that like button and subscribe right now before we go any further, because this channel is here for exactly these stories, for the moments when the version gives way to the thing itself, and we come back with one every single week. Now let us talk about Meera. Meera Krishnamurthy was 64 years old and had been born in Chennai, India, and had come to the United States at 22 with a graduate student visa and a chemistry degree, and the specific, particular quality of someone who had been the most capable person in most rooms she had entered in Chennai, and who had arrived in Houston, Texas, prepared to be the most capable person in most rooms she entered in Houston, and who had been, with occasional adjustments for context, correct about this assessment. She had spent 36 years as a pharmaceutical chemist, not in the laboratory in the romantic, abstract sense of scientific discovery, but in the specific, applied, practically consequential work of drug development and quality assurance, the chemistry that resulted in the compounds that arrived in pharmacy bottles and that needed to be exactly right in the specific, unforgiving way that chemistry required when the result was something that people took when they were sick and trusted to help them. She had done this work with the complete, methodical excellence of someone for whom accuracy was not a professional standard, but a personal one, someone who had understood from the beginning that the difference between close and correct was not a difference she was willing to accept in any domain. She had retired 2 years ago. She found retirement, she would tell you directly if you asked, considerably more demanding than working, in the specific way that people for whom being useful is the organizing principle of their days find the restructuring of their days around the absence of the useful to be its own full-time project. She was managing it. Her husband Rajan was 67 and had been born in Bangalore and had also come to the United States on a graduate student visa. In his case, an electrical engineering degree and the specific, grounded, patient intelligence of a man who had spent his career understanding complex systems and who had developed, from that career, the particular quality of someone who looked at any sufficiently complicated thing and instinctively searched for the underlying structure. He had spent 33 years in semiconductor design and had a long list of patents with his name on them, and a reputation among people who knew the field that was built on the specific, reliable, decade after decade delivery of work that was not just technically correct, but elegantly so, which in engineering as in chemistry meant the thing that was the right answer, and not merely an answer. He was quieter than Meera in the specific way of someone who had an enormous amount going on internally and who had learned to select carefully what he shared externally, which was not the same as having nothing to say, but was sometimes mistaken for it by people who had not yet had a long conversation with him. They had been married for 42 years, and the marriage had been arranged. Their daughter Priya was 38 and was a pediatrician in Houston with her mother's precision and her father's patience. A combination that produced, in a pediatrician, exactly the qualities pediatrics required and that her patient's parents had been relying on for 9 years. She had grown up watching her parents' marriage with the specific, observational attention of a child who was curious about everything, and who had directed that curiosity at the primary relationship in her household with the same thoroughness she directed it at everything else, and who had arrived, through 38 years of watching, at a comprehensive and mostly accurate understanding of what that relationship actually was. Their son Vikram, 35, was a software engineer who had his father's structural intelligence and his mother's directness, and a sense of humor he had fully developed in the United States in ways that sometimes still surprised Rajan, who found the humor excellent but occasionally faster than he expected. Priya's husband Daniel, 40, was an emergency medicine physician, white, from Ohio, who had been part of the family for 12 years and who had learned over 12 years to be genuinely comfortable in rooms where he was the person who understood the least context and who had the least history, which was a skill that emergency medicine also required, and that he brought to both settings with the same grounded equanimity. And Meera's mother-in-law Lakshmi, 91, who had flown from Bangalore for this trip, and who had been the one, 42 years ago, who had initially arranged the match, and who was sitting at the end of the podium with the specific, satisfied, entirely composed quality of a woman who had been right about something important 4 decades ago, and who had not forgotten this. They had applied because Vikram had submitted the application as a Christmas gift for his mother, accurately calculating that Meera would be excellent at it, and slightly miscalculating how much of the afternoon would be spent not on the game, but on the far more interesting subject of how his parents had come to be married, which was a subject he had grown up with but that he had not anticipated would turn out to be something that Steve Harvey would find completely absorbing, and that the studio audience would receive as if hearing a story they had not known they needed. The opposing family was the Williams family from Atlanta, a warm, well-prepared, cheerfully competitive family of 5 who arrived ready to win and who were going to have the experience of being the uncomplicated team in an afternoon where the uncomplicated team's job was to play the game while the other side of the stage produced something that nobody had scheduled. The pregame was where it began. Steve Harvey moved through both families with the customary ease and attention, and arrived at Meera with the genuine, curious warmth he extended to people who were clearly going to have something interesting to say. He asked about the chemistry career, and Meera told him about it, the drug development, the quality assurance, the specific, unforgiving accuracy of pharmaceutical chemistry, in the direct, unpretentious way of someone who found the work genuinely interesting and who did not require it to sound glamorous to discuss it comfortably. Steve Harvey said it sounded like work that required you to be right every time, not most of the time. Meera said that was precisely correct, and that most of the time was not a standard she had ever found acceptable. Steve Harvey said he felt that. The audience laughed. Meera received the laugh with the slight, composed smile of a woman who was aware she had said something that was funny and who had not been trying to be funny and who was fine with both of those things being true. He asked about Rajan. Meera said he was a retired semiconductor engineer with 33 years of patents, and that he was considerably more interesting than he appeared to be at first, which she said with the specific, warm directness of someone who had known a thing for 42 years, and who did not feel the need to dress it up. Rajan, standing beside her, received this with the patient expression of a man who had been described this way by his wife for 42 years, and who had decided at some early point that the description was accurate and worth accepting. Steve Harvey asked how they had met. Meera said, "Our marriage was arranged." Steve Harvey looked at her with the genuine, curious attention of someone receiving information that he wanted to understand fully. He said, "Tell me about that." What followed was the thing that the afternoon was built around, though nobody had known it was coming, and nobody had put it on a schedule. Meera told Steve Harvey about arranged marriage in the specific, direct, entirely non-apologetic way of someone describing a thing they have been inside for 42 years, and who therefore had access to the actual thing rather than the version. She did not defend it, and she did not explain it away, and she did not compare it to anything else to make it more legible. She simply described it from the inside as it had been. She said that in her family, in Chennai in the early 1980s, the arrangement meant that her parents had identified candidates, men of compatible background and education and values, and that she had met them, and that she had had opinions about what she found, and that her opinions had mattered and had been the determining factor. She said she had met 4 men before Rajan. She said she had found all 4 of them in various ways insufficient. She said she had been very clear about the insufficiency which her mother had found exhausting and which she had found non-negotiable. Steve Harvey said, "You were running the process." Meera said, "I was always running the process. They brought me candidates. I evaluated them." Steve Harvey said, "What happened when Rajan came in?" Meera looked at Rajan with the expression that 42 years of a particular kind of looking produced. The specific, warm, completely direct, Entirely unromantic and entirely romantic expression of someone who had been looking at a specific person for 42 years, and who saw the same person they had always seen, and who also, in this specific room on this specific afternoon, was about to tell the story of the first time they saw him. She said, "He was late." Steve Harvey said, "He was late." Meera said, 20 minutes late to a meeting he was being evaluated for. My mother was furious. I was interested. Steve Harvey looked at Rajan. He said, "You were late." Rajan said in the specific, measured voice of a man who had been accountable for this for 42 years and who had made peace with the accountability. "I was debugging a problem. I lost track of time." Steve Harvey said, "You were late to meet your potential wife because you were debugging a problem." Rajan said, "It was an important problem." Meera said, "I asked him what the problem was. He told me, for 40 minutes, in complete technical detail that I could follow because I had a chemistry degree and was not afraid of technical detail. My mother served tea and looked at the ceiling." She paused. "At the end of it, I told him the problem had an elegant solution that he had missed. He asked me what it was. I told him. He was quiet for 30 seconds. He said, 'That's correct.'" The audience produced the sound of people who have just understood that they are watching the origin story of something real. Steve Harvey said, "He said that's correct." Meera said, "That's correct." She said it in the voice of a 22-year-old hearing exactly the right response to something she had said, delivered in the specific way a man delivers it when he has checked the work and confirmed the finding and is reporting accurately rather than performing agreement. In 1982 in China, a man looked at my answer and said, "That's correct." Not, "You're very smart for a woman." Not, "How interesting." "That's correct." Accurate, immediate, no qualification. Looked at Steve Harvey with the direct, plain expression of someone stating the obvious. "I told my mother that afternoon that I was going to marry him." Steve Harvey said, "Because he said that's correct." Meera said, "Because he said that's correct." Steve Harvey stood with this for a moment. He looked at Rajan. He said, "Sir, do you know that the reason your wife married you is because you called her correct?" Rajan said, "She has told me this many times." Steve Harvey said, "How does that make you feel?" Rajan considered this with the patient, internal quality he brought to questions that deserved actual answers. He said, "It makes me feel that I was lucky to have been late. If I had been on time, I would have been more careful and might have said something more polished." He paused. "She didn't want something polished." Meera said, "I specifically did not want something polished." Steve Harvey looked at the audience. He looked at both of them. He said, "So, 42 years ago. A man is late because he is debugging a problem he considers important. A woman asks him about the problem and demonstrates that she can follow it. He tells her in complete detail. She gives him the solution he missed. He says that's correct, and she decides to marry him." He paused. "That is one of the best love stories I have heard in my life, and it happened inside an arranged marriage." He looked at Meera. He said, "I want to ask you something. When people hear arranged marriage, people who didn't grow up with it, what do they get wrong?" Meera received this question with the expression of someone who had been asked a version of it many times and who had thought carefully about the answer. She said, "They hear arranged and they think decided, as if the person being married had no role in the deciding." She looked at Steve Harvey directly. "I decided. My parents brought me options. I was the decision maker. The arrangement was not that someone else chose for me. The arrangement was that I had assistance in finding people worth meeting." She paused. "In the West, you also have assistants. You have friends who introduce you and apps that show you profiles and offices where you work alongside people. The assistance is different. The principle that you evaluate and you decide is the same." She said, "What was different was the transparency of the process. Everyone understood what was happening. There was no pretense that it was something other than what it was, which was two people considering whether they were well matched, with the support of families who also had a stake in the answer." Steve Harvey said, "And what about love? The version that most people here probably grew up with says love comes first and then marriage." Meera looked at him with the expression of someone who has been sitting with a question for 42 years and who has arrived at the answer that experience provides. She said, "Love came. It came differently than in the stories, not like a door opening but like a building being built. You don't fall in love, you construct it, brick by brick, decision by decision, year by year." She looked at Rajan. 42 years of construction, the building is load-bearing now, it will not come down." She looked back at Steve Harvey. "I would not trade that building for a door." The room was very still. The specific stillness that arrived when something had been said that the room needed to stay in for a moment. Steve Harvey said, in the quiet voice that was his truest voice, "I would not trade that building for a door." He said it as if weighing the sentence. He said, "I have been on television for 30 years. I have interviewed thousands of people. I have talked to couples about their marriages on this show every single week for 14 years. He paused. I have never heard someone describe 42 years of marriage better than that. He looked at Lakshmi, 91, at the end of the podium, the woman who had arranged the match, who had made the initial call, who had been right about Rajan in a way that Meera had confirmed every subsequent year for 4 decades. He said, "Ma'am, did you know what you were doing?" Lakshmi looked at him with the composed, entirely unimpressed quality of a 91-year-old woman who had been right about important things for 9 decades, and who did not require the room's confirmation of this fact, but who also did not mind receiving it. She said, in the direct, deliberate English of someone for whom it was a third language and who had mastered it anyway. "I knew Meera. I knew what she required. Rajan was correct for her." She paused. "I was not surprised." Steve Harvey produced the laugh that the afternoon had been building toward, the full, genuine, complete laugh of a man who has been given the perfect sentence by the perfect person at the perfect moment. He said, "She was not surprised." He said it to the audience. He said it to the camera. He said it again because it was still getting funnier. "The woman who made the match is not surprised that it worked." He looked at Lakshmi with the full warmth of a man who was genuinely delighted. "Ma'am." "How many of these did you do?" Lakshmi said. "In my family, many." Steve Harvey said. "How many worked?" Lakshmi said after the brief pause of someone performing a mental inventory. "All of them." Steve Harvey held both hands up. He looked at the audience. He said, "I need everyone to understand what just happened. This woman just told me she arranged multiple marriages and they all worked. All of them." He looked at Lakshmi. He said, "What is your secret?" Lakshmi said with the unhurried, precise quality of someone delivering something she has known for 70 years. "You must understand the person before you find the match, not what they want. Who they are, what they require, these are not the same." Steve Harvey was still for a moment. He said, "What they want and who they are and what they require are not the same." Lakshmi said, "Rarely." Steve Harvey said, "Ma'am, I should have met you 30 years ago." The room laughed. Lakshmi received it with the composed, slightly pleased expression of a woman who has been receiving the room's laughter for 91 years, and who has found it consistently more entertaining than she lets on. Daniel, Priya's husband from Ohio, who had been standing at his position on the podium through all of this with the attentive, grounded quality of a man who had spent 12 years being the person with the least context in the room, and who had learned to find that position interesting rather than uncomfortable, said, "I just want to say that I understand now why my mother-in-law evaluated me for 3 years before she was satisfied." Meera turned to Daniel with the expression she had been using on him for 12 years, which was the expression of someone who found a person both thoroughly examined and thoroughly approved and who wanted both of those things to be known. She said, "You required time, you were worth it." Daniel said, "That is genuinely the best thing she has ever said to me." Priya said, "That's true, write it down." The game began. Steve Harvey moved into it with the specific, slightly still smiling quality of a man who has just been somewhere, and who is going back to the work with the work's warmth and the somewhere's residue simultaneously. The Krishnamurthy family played the game with the organized, coordinated excellence of a team that had practiced, and that had also, it turned out, a natural aptitude for the survey, for understanding what other people thought and said. That was perhaps not surprising in a family that had spent decades thinking carefully about the gap between what people wanted and who they were and what they required. Meera was excellent in the specific way the afternoon had established she would be: accurate, fast, unhesitating, applying the same standard she had applied to pharmaceutical chemistry and to candidate evaluation and to 42 years of a marriage she had decided on herself. She was right the way she was always right, which was completely and without apology, and with the specific satisfaction of someone whose primary relationship with accuracy was one of long mutual respect. Rajan was precise and quick in the way that someone who had spent 33 years in semiconductor design was precise and quick, which was to say he found the correct answer efficiently and delivered it without embellishment, and the board received it the same way it had been receiving correct answers all afternoon. Priya was warm and fast. Vikram had the specific, quick comedy instinct of someone who had grown up between two cultures and had learned to read the humor frequency of any room instantly and to answer on it. Daniel played with the focused, competent, entirely game equanimity of a man who had passed a 3-year evaluation and who understood that there was nothing on this stage more demanding than that. And Lakshmi, 91, who had arranged matches across generations and who had told Steve Harvey she was not surprised when they worked, played Family Feud with the complete, composed, entirely unhurried accuracy of a woman who had spent 9 decades understanding people, what they required, who they were, the difference between those things, and who found the survey questions. It appeared somewhat straightforward. Three of her four answers in the main game were number 1. The fourth was number 2. Steve Harvey watched this happen and said after her second number 1 simply, "Of course." The Krishnamurthy family won the main game. Meera went first in fast money. There was no discussion about this. Rajan had suggested it before the taping. Priya had agreed. Vikram had said obviously. Meera had said she would try not to be disappointed if all 5 were not number 1, which Rajan had received with the patient expression of a man who had been assessing his wife's accuracy for 42 years, and who considered this outcome unlikely. She stood at the fast money podium with the posture she brought to everything, upright, organized, forward-facing, the posture of someone who had been correct many times and who had no particular reason to expect this time to be different, but who was not assuming, because assuming was not the practice, and the practice was what produced the work. Steve Harvey looked at her from across the stage. He said, "For Rajan, and for the building." Meera said, "For the building." He hit the button. Meera Krishnamurthy answered 5 Family Feud survey questions in 20 seconds with the methodical, unhesitating, entirely accurate intelligence of a woman who had spent 36 years in pharmaceutical chemistry and 42 years understanding one specific person, and who had, from both of those practices, developed the most precise and most comprehensive model of what people said and thought and did when they were being honest that the room had seen. She did not translate. She did not qualify. She said what the survey wanted in the specific voice of someone who had always known the difference between correct and close, and who had never been interested in close. All 5 answers hit the board. 4 were number 1. Her 5th answer, delivered with the same unhurried precision as the first 4, was number 1, 5 for 5. Rajan, at the family podium, received this with the expression of a man who was not surprised. Lakshmi, 91, made a small sound that was not quite approval and was not quite satisfaction, but that contained both. Priya put her head briefly on Daniel's shoulder. Vikram, who had submitted the application as a Christmas gift and had somewhat underestimated what the afternoon would become, stood beside his father with an expression that was going to take a few days to fully process. Combined total, 311 points. They had won $20,000. Steve Harvey brought the check to Meera and Rajan together. He held it between them and looked at both of them and said, 42 years, started because he said that's correct, built brick by brick, decision by decision, year by year. He looked at Meera. You said you would not trade the building for a door. Meera said, I would not. Steve Harvey looked at Rajan. He said, Sir, you are a very lucky man. Rajan said, I know. Steve Harvey said, because she says you are, or because you know. Rajan said, because I know, she says it too, which I appreciate, but I know. Steve Harvey held the check between them and looked at the room and said, this is what it looks like, 42 years in. This is what a building looks like. He said it to the audience and to the camera and to anyone watching and to himself. He said, take notes. The episode aired 6 weeks later. The clip spread in the specific way that things spread when they name something that a large number of people have been thinking about imprecisely and are suddenly able to think about more precisely. The specific phrase, you don't fall in love, you construct it, spread widely, quoted in places far from game shows, by people who had found in the construction metaphor something that described their own relationships more accurately than the falling metaphor had, and who were grateful for the replacement. People who had grown up with arranged marriage shared it with the specific, relieved quality of people watching something that had been a part of their lives, and their families represented not as a curiosity or a controversy, but as a practice with an interior, a practice that was complex and human, and that produced, in this specific case, and in many others, the kind of marriage that Steve Harvey correctly identified as worth looking at. People who had grown up without arranged marriage shared it too, with the thoughtful, recalibrating quality of people who had received a more complete version of something they thought they already understood, and who were doing the updating that good information required. Several wrote about the what they want, and who they are, and what they require are not the same, which Lakshmi had said in her precise, deliberate English, and which produced a very large number of people spending time with that distinction and applying it to their own situations and finding it useful. Several wrote about the 3 years that Meera had taken to approve Daniel, and about what a 3-year evaluation said about taking someone seriously, and about the specific, perhaps undervalued idea that the people who love you having an opinion about the person you are with was not a threat to your autonomy, but was, in the specific way Meera had described it, a form of assistance. Meera gave a brief interview 2 months after the broadcast in which she was, as expected, completely direct and specific and unwilling to generalize beyond what her own experience warranted. She said her marriage was her marriage, and that arranged marriage, like every other form of marriage, produced outcomes that depended entirely on the people inside it, and the quality of their judgment and the seriousness of their attention to each other. She said she had been serious about Rajan from the afternoon. He said that's correct, and that seriousness had been the building material for 42 years. She said she was sometimes asked whether she thought young people today should consider arranged marriage, and she said she was not qualified to tell other people what they should consider, but that she thought the questions Lakshmi had taught her to ask, not what they want, but who they are and what they require, were questions that anyone in any kind of relationship might find worth asking. And that the answers were sometimes surprising and were always informative, and that having accurate information about the person you were building something with was, in her experience, the most important ingredient in the building. She said she was still building. She said after 42 years, the work was different than it was in the early years, less about establishing the structure, and more about the maintenance of a thing that had become very large and that required, as large structures did, continuous and careful and competent attention. She said she and Rajan had that competence and had always had it, and that was, she said, not accidental. It was the result of 42 years of choosing daily to bring the same standard to the marriage that they brought to their work, which was the standard of someone for whom correct and close were not the same and who was not interested in close. She said Rajan agreed. She said he had told her so. She said, that's correct. There are things that a room decides it already knows. And there is a woman from China who sat down with a game show host, and in the course of telling him the truth of her 42-year marriage, in the specific, direct, entirely unpretentious way she told everything, replaced the version with the thing. The building is load-bearing now. It will not come down. She would not trade it for a door. Rajan knows it. She says it, which he appreciates, but he knows. Lakshmi, 91, is not surprised. She knew Meera. She knew what she required. She brought her candidates. Meera ran the process. The building went up. It is still going up. It is going to keep going up brick by brick, decision by decision, year by year, with the same standard that pharmaceutical chemistry required, and that the match required, and that 42 years have required. Not close. Correct. If this story reached you, if it changed the version you were carrying, or if the building metaphor landed somewhere real, or if Lakshmi's distinction between what they want and who they are, and what they require is a sentence you are going to be thinking about, share this today. Share it with someone who has been given the version and who deserves the thing. Leave a comment below and tell us what you're carrying from this story, because this community carries things together and your voice here matters. And if you are not already with us, subscribe right now, because every single week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the rooms that receive the actual thing and replace the version with it. Stories about the building that will not come down. And stories about the man who said that's correct, and the woman who heard it, and the 42 years that followed. We will see you in the next one.